It began with a whisper, a name spreading across China like a curse. People said he was untouchable, a man who lived like a king, ruling not from a palace, but from behind layers of deceit, fear, and unimaginable cruelty. His empire wasn't built on land, but on lies. Yet, to those trapped within it, he was a god. What started as a small scam turned into one of the most terrifying criminal networks in modern Chinese history, a web of fraud, abduction, and bloodshed that would later earn its creator the chilling title, the Fraud Emperor of China, the birth of a deceiver. Before he became the so-called Fraud Emperor, he was just another ambitious man in a struggling town in central China. His real name was almost forgotten in the chaos that followed his crimes. He grew up poor, clever, and bitter. He watched rich men build empires not from hard work but manipulation. That idea took root in his mind early. If power was a game, he would play it better than anyone else. At first, his schemes were small. Fake business ventures, investment scams, counterfeit goods. He learned how people thought, what made them trust, what made them desperate, and how to exploit both. He wasn't just a con artist, he was a student of human weakness. When China's economy began to boom, he saw opportunity everywhere. He used charm and precision to recruit others, men who were loyal, brutal, and desperate like him. Together, they formed what they called the Empire of Prosperity. To the outside world, it looked like a company. Inside, it was something else entirely, a machine built to deceive, control, and destroy. The rise of the fraud empire. The organization started by running phone scams calls that preyed on fear and confusion. Victims were told they'd violated financial laws, owed money, or could avoid arrest by paying fines. At first, the scams were crude, but the fraud emperor turned it into an art form. He trained his people like soldiers. They learned scripts, studied psychology, and even mimicked police officers' voices. When other gangs fought for territory, he did something different. He centralized. He built compounds in remote provinces where hundreds of employees worked around the clock, defrauding victims nationwide. They were forced to meet daily quotas. Those who failed were beaten. But then came the real horror. When voluntary scammers tried to quit, the emperor refused to let them leave. He realized that controlling fear was more profitable than paying loyalty. Workers who asked to leave were declared traitors. They were locked in rooms, starved, and tortured. The company had evolved into something darker, a cult of obedience, led by a man who believed himself chosen by fate to dominate. The rule of fear. Inside the fraud compounds, every second was controlled. Guards watched from towers, workers slept in shifts, meals were rationed, surveillance cameras were everywhere. The fraud emperor, surrounded by bodyguards, rarely appeared in person, but his voice echoed through loudspeakers, preaching discipline and obedience. He told his followers that what they were doing wasn't crime, it was justice. He said the victims outside were corrupt, greedy citizens who deserved punishment. In his twisted vision, he wasn't stealing, he was cleansing society. Anyone who questioned him was accused of betrayal and dragged to the basement, a place most never returned from. According to testimonies from those who escaped, the punishments were inhuman. People were beaten with steel rods, tied to chairs for days, electrocuted, or drowned in barrels. Women were often targeted for humiliation. Some were sold, others forced into marriages with guards. Still, no one dared rebel. Fear was absolute. The mass kidnappings, the fraud emperor's hunger for power didn't stop with his workers. When the network began losing members who tried to flee, he gave a terrifying order. If they won't come willingly, bring them by force. That marked the start of the mass kidnappings. Across several provinces, gangs affiliated with his empire began abducting young men and women from small towns, especially those unemployed or looking for jobs. Victims were lured with false job offers, then drugged and transported to hidden compounds surrounded by barbed wire. Once inside, they were stripped of identification, phones, and dignity. Guards broke their spirits with violence and isolation. Some were brainwashed into joining willingly. Others became so terrified they obeyed every command. One survivor, who later escaped, described how they were forced to defraud elderly citizens online for 18 hours straight, and anyone who failed to meet the quota was beaten in front of everyone. It wasn't a business, he said. It was a prison built on lies. By the time authorities began noticing a pattern of missing people, hundreds, possibly thousands had already vanished. Blood on the throne. As his empire grew, the fraud emperor began to lose touch with reality. He started wearing royal robes during his private ceremonies, calling himself the chosen emperor of the new dynasty. His followers had to kneel when he passed. He claimed he could see impure energy in those who doubted him and ordered public punishments to cleanse them. Executions became part of his reign. Anyone caught stealing, escaping, or disobeying orders was executed in front of others, sometimes with the entire compound forced to watch. Victims were hung, burned, or thrown into pits as examples. To his men, it was a display of divine justice. To everyone else, it was madness. But fear made monsters of ordinary people. Guards who had once hesitated soon began enjoying the power. The compound transformed into a kingdom of terror. Even local officials, intimidated by his wealth and influence, turned a blind eye. Rumors said he paid off police departments and politicians to keep them silent. The emperor ruled not through law, but through corruption and silence. The investigation that nearly failed, it took years for Chinese authorities to connect the dots. Missing persons cases across multiple provinces didn't initially seem related, but when a young man escaped from one of the compounds and went directly to the police, everything changed. He was covered in bruises, half-starved, and terrified. He revealed the truth about the fraud emperor's network, the kidnappings, the torture, the killings. Investigators didn't believe him at first. The story sounded too grotesque. But when they traced his details, they found dozens of similar disappearances. The Ministry of Public Security launched one of the largest undercover operations in the region's history. Officers infiltrated local gangs, traced money flows, and identified phone networks used by the fraud rings. Slowly, they began to piece together the scale of the empire. It wasn't a few hundred scammers. It was a fully industrialized system of crime, spanning provinces and crossing into neighboring countries. When the raid was finally ordered, the police faced armed resistance. Dozens of guards fought to protect their emperor, but after a 48-hour standoff, the fraud emperor was captured, surrounded by his loyalists who refused to believe he could die. The fall of the fraud emperor. The images from the compound stunned the nation. Hidden chambers were found underground, filled with cages and tools of torture. Files documenting fake identities, bank transfers, and victims' information covered the walls. Investigators uncovered burial sites containing dozens of bodies, some workers, some kidnapped victims. When the fraud emperor was brought to court, he showed no remorse. He smiled during the hearings, occasionally mocking the victims' families. His only defense was chilling. They were all willing. The weak exist for the strong. The trial revealed the full extent of his empire. Over 200 people confirmed dead, thousands enslaved, and more than $1 billion yuan stolen through scams. Survivors testified in tears, describing the daily horrors of life inside his kingdom. The public was outraged. Eventually, he was sentenced to death. But even as he was led away, he turned to the courtroom and declared, "You can kill me, but my empire will never die." The psychological grip of power. What made the fraud emperor so dangerous wasn't just his cruelty, it was his ability to manipulate. Experts who studied his case described him as a master of psychological domination. He used humiliation to break people, then kindness to rebuild them into loyal followers. He made victims believe that suffering for him was noble. That's the terrifying truth of such leaders. They don't force loyalty through guns alone. They twist the human mind until obedience feels like faith. In his world, morality was inverted. To kill was to serve, to deceive was to save, and to die was to be purified. Even after his death sentence, several of his followers continued to defend him online, calling him a misunderstood visionary. It showed how deep his influence ran even after the empire fell. His poison lingered. The legacy of horror. After the case broke, China tightened regulations on telecommunication fraud and increased surveillance of rural compounds, but the scars remain. Families of kidnapped victims still search for missing loved ones. Some bodies were never identified. The story became a symbol of how greed and power can infect entire systems. It also exposed the darker side of economic desperation. how people searching for opportunity can become prey, and how the line between victim and accomplice can blur when survival is at stake. Many wondered how one man could gain such control over so many. But the answer lies in something simple and tragic: fear. Once fear takes root, logic dies, and tyranny thrives. The story of the fraud emperor isn't just a crime, it's a warning. It shows what happens when ambition turns to obsession, and when deception grows unchecked until it becomes its own kingdom. He didn't wear a crown, but his rule was real, built on blood, lies, and the silence of those too afraid to speak. His empire may be gone, but the lesson it left behind is eternal. Evil doesn't always march with armies or flags. Sometimes it sits behind a desk, smiling, offering you a deal that feels too good to be true. And when you sign that deal, you don't just lose your money, you lose your soul.